Doris, thank you very much for coming to Los Angeles.
Very glad to be here.
And thank you to all of the audience for coming on a night when LeBron James is playing down the street. You've picked Doris Kearns Goodwin over LeBron James. And on a night when just a few blocks away the Dodgers are playing in Game 1 of the playoffs. We love all things Doris Kearns Goodwin, but please don't come on a playoff night the next time.
Did you tell them that the score is now 5-0?
Oh!
In the 8th inning?
We love everything about you, except for the fact that you used to be a Dodgers fan.
Well, they abandoned us. They took us to... I couldn't even follow baseball. I was so devastated when they left Brooklyn, because I'd originally been a Brooklyn Dodger fan, until finally I went to Fenway Park, so reminiscent of old Ebbets Field, a team that almost always won and then almost always lost in the end, and I loved them passionately. We've had season tickets now for more than 35 years. But if the Red Sox get undone by the Yankees, which is a possibility, but a yay, I promise you I will be a Dodger fan.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. You've written a terrific book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, something that we can't relate to right now. You write about 4 presidents, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson, men that you know so well, you've written about so many times. We're going to get to the book in a couple of minutes, but first I have to ask you about the news of the day, and specifically about the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court situation. Our country is so polarized today, and we have a president who is willing to single out and mock a single American citizen, in this case, Dr. Ford. I was going to ask you, has any other president ever done anything like that? And I think I know the answer to that, but I wonder how will President Trump, no matter how you feel about the president or about who's right or who's wrong, how will the president be judged in history about this moment?
Well, what's so clear about the 4 leaders that I wrote about was that at their best, their personal ambition was attached to a larger ambition to unify the country, to end divisions, and to summon the citizenry to a common cause. And when I think about, as you asked, the mocking of Dr. Ford, it reminds me when Abraham Lincoln was young, he had a really great ability. He was so funny, but he used it at one point to mock an opponent. And he made fun of the way he walked, the way he talked, you know, and the kind of gestures that he made. And it was so terrible, but so fitting that people laughed, and it was called for weeks. People talked about it. He felt so badly that he'd done that. He not only apologized to the person, but he promised himself, I will never do that again, ever do that again. What it showed when he did that, when President Trump did that, is one of the most important qualities in a leader, which is empathy, understanding how other persons think and feel. The idea that you could take that young woman and do that to her in public view and use it for a partisan advantage just showed how polarized the country has become. This is a Supreme Court nominee, and this person is supposed to be sitting in equal judgment on people. And what worries me about this situation is there was a moment in the 1850s that recalls this in a sudden way, the way we are so polarized. We looked at this decision as one party or another, as the other or the other. And in the 1850s, there was a moment when a congressman from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, came into the Senate floor, and he hit a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, over the head with a cane. He was sitting down, and he kept hitting him with the cane. He fell unconscious and was out of the office for weeks. But the most important thing was that in the South, he was made a hero. And everybody got canes, and they presented him with a golden cane. And in the North, it so quickened the anti-slavery movement that, interestingly, it led to the rebirth and the formation of the Republican Party. And it led to Abraham Lincoln. So if we want to believe that something good may come out of this terrible week, it may be that it awakens even more the citizens to know they have a responsibility to do something to heal these divisions, to get active in public life. We're already seeing more women running for office than ever before. We're seeing young people who are interested in politics. And if we as citizens take up our responsibilities, we can do something about this feeling, as we've been spectators this week, of something that's really sad in our American life.
Leadership in turbulent times, obviously it can refer to the times that we live in today. They're not the best of times, but are they the worst of times?
No, there's one thing I think history can assure you is they are not the worst of times. I mean, when Lincoln took office, the country was about to go into a civil war where more than 600,000 would be dead. When Teddy came in during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot more violence in the air between capital and labor. FDR comes in at the height of the Depression, and when LBJ comes in after the assassination, there's a sense of the civil rights movement tearing the country apart. The fact is, though, we had the right leader at the right time then, and you need the leader and the citizens together. And I think what makes us feel today with a sense of lost moorings is that we're beginning to feel like what's happening, the unprecedented nature of breaking news every day, something bad happening, is that it's become normal. It's almost as if people who've lived in war for so long can't even imagine what peace is like. So my real hope for the book is that if we can see what it was like when we had times that were worse than these and shine a light on the leadership that was necessary to bring us through, we can hope that we will come through this. Not only hope, but we can make it happen. Otherwise, if we lose that sense that we can do something about this, then we're really in a lost moorings, I think.
Because I think we do search for that today. We think, okay, it's beyond me. It's happening in Washington. I'm just a person. I'm a citizen. What can I do? And you approach that question.
No, we can't be spectators. I mean, I think that's the real lesson from all this. And there are these signs. So I'm always an optimist. Maybe it was because of having been a Brooklyn Dodger fan and a Red Sox fan for so long. I was waiting forever and ever for those World Series. But I think it's part of my temperament. But more than that, I think history tells us that in this great country, we've come through these things before and we can do it again. We have to believe that. There's no other choice.
Of the four men that you write about, is there one who, if he was able to go through a time machine, would be best suited to be the president today?
In a strange way, I mean, I'd always rather bring Lincoln with me anywhere I went because he's so amazing. I loved living with that man. Oh my God, he was the best. But and then I got to live with him another 5 years when they were making the movie on him, so he's really been a huge part of my life. In fact, I have this terrible feeling sometimes that I've lived with these people so long that I know them, and people may wonder, why would you spend your life looking at dead presidents? It's a rather strange profession, but I wouldn't change it. The only worry I have is in the afterlife there's going to be a panel of all the presidents I've ever studied, and every single one will tell me every single thing I got wrong about them, and the first person will scream out, and that will be Lyndon Johnson. How come those other damn books were twice as long as the book he wrote about me? But if I were going to bring somebody back for today's world, it would probably be Teddy Roosevelt, and that's in part because the conditions at the Industrial Revolution really were like ours in a certain sense. It so shaken up the economy, the Industrial Revolution. There was a gap between the rich and the poor, lots of inequities in the system, big companies swallowing small companies, immigrants coming in from abroad, and people feeling anxious about the fact that so many new inventions had really sped up the pace of life. And Teddy Roosevelt was able to come in and offer what had been a populist group of people who were really against elites and really somewhat violent in their reactions to things, offer them what he called a square deal. And that would be for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the wage worker. And he also had that kind of colorfulness that you probably need, unfortunately, in our entertainment world. He could be the center of attention just as President Trump is. He could absolutely rival him if he's on the stage. The spotlight would be on him as well. It was said that he so wanted to be the center of attention that he wanted to be the baby at the baptism and the bride at the wedding and the corpse at the funeral. But I think the point is that he understood that a deal was good for both sides, not just to win, which I think is somewhat what President Trump talked about in his art of the deal. What matters is not that both sides win, but rather that I win. And so I think he could rival him he'd be great in the Twitterverse. Today he had all those short sayings, speak softly and carry a big stick, don't hit until you have to. He even gave Maxwell House the slogan, good to the very last drop. So I think he could rival him on tweets, and I think his fiery passion for the square deal would absolutely be great if he were in a Republican primary against President Trump in these days.
I want to explore the other presidents in a moment, but since you bring up Teddy Roosevelt, he grew up in this atmosphere of sort of elitism, and yet he spent time when he was first elected with the working class, with the immigrants, and learning the way they speak. And was that a calculated thing from a politician who was on the way up, or was he genuinely interested, as Bobby Kennedy was when he was running? He seemed to have a connection with the working class man.
It's a very good question, because I think, for some people, empathy is maybe inborn, as I think it was for Lincoln. Even when he was a little kid, there was a moment when he's walking with a group of people and he sees his friends putting hot coals on turtles to make them wriggle, and he goes over and says, "This is wrong." And later, when he's a little older, he sees somebody who had fallen into a ditch as a drunk person, and everybody walks by and he goes back and picks him up and takes him home. But for Teddy, he admitted that when he first went into the state legislature at 23, he didn't go in to make other people's lives better. But the experience of being in that legislature took him into tenements, and he saw what the lives of those people were like. When he was police commissioner, he was wandering the streets between midnight and 5 a.m. He saw what the people in the slums were living like. When he became a soldier, he was sharing his tent and his food with the fellow soldiers. Politics and the broadening of his experiences taught him, as he said, to see the way other people live. He said maybe it's conscious at first, self-conscious, when you're coming from a privileged background and you walk into one of these settings. But after a while, he said, that fellow feeling develops. And that's what politics at its best can do. It was one of the disheartening things about the 2016 election that so broken had our political system become in Washington, that being a non-politician was considered a great thing. And if you don't have experience as a leader, much less as a politician, where you've been involved with other people's lives and you care about them, you can't bring that to the office of the presidency. It's too late by that period of time.
You say in the foreword of the book that the book is sort of a continuation of a discussion that you had as, I guess, an undergrad, when you said you weren't really qualified to answer these questions, but you asked a series of questions, and I'll just sort of tick them off and then ask you to answer them. 1, are leaders born or made? 2, where does ambition come from? 3, how does adversity affect the growth of leadership? 4, do the times make the leader, or does the leader shape the times? 5, what is the difference between power, title, and leadership? And 6, is leadership possible without purpose larger than personal ambition? Let's start with 1. Are leaders born or made?
Well, I think there's no question that some leadership traits probably are inborn. I mean, Lincoln had that born with empathy, as I said, and he had a gift for language that was pretty special, probably from the time he was made. And I think Teddy Roosevelt had this incredible curiosity and a photographic memory of everything he'd ever read or learned. FDR was lucky enough to be given an optimistic, confident temperament. And LBJ was just born with unbounded energy. But mostly important is not what people are born with, but as Teddy Roosevelt said, there's 2 kinds of success. One is somebody who has a talent that nobody else could equal, and they're just going to make it big, like a great poet or Lincoln at Gettysburg. But most success of most people, he said, including himself, comes from using the talents that you have to an extraordinary degree by the application of hard, sustained work. So there's no question that they're mostly made, even though born with some qualities that start.
Where does ambition come from?
That's the mystery. That's the mystery for all of us. Think about if you could ask yourself, where did the ambition to become what you became start? I mean, in Lincoln's case, it's amazing. He's only 23 years old, and he runs for the state legislature after only having lived in New Salem, Illinois for 6 months. And he writes this amazing handbill. In those days, you had to write something to say why you wanted to run for office. And he said, every man has peculiar ambition. Mine is to be esteemed of by my fellow man, by making myself worthy of their esteem. He's 23. And then he says, I'm not sure I'm going to have a chance to have you voters vote for me. I have no wealthy relations to recommend me. And if I lose, I've been too familiar with disappointment to be very much chagrined. But then he says, which is amazing, but if I lose, I'm going to try again. In fact, he said, I'm going to try 5 or 6 times, but if then I lose 5 or 6 times, I may be too humiliated, and I promise you I'll never try again. Which means that he had resilience right away from the start. The interesting thing about FDR was that he didn't run for office until he was 28, Teddy was also 23. Lyndon Johnson wanted to be in politics from the time he was 2, much less 23. And FDR just had not been a particularly good student at Groton or Harvard or Columbia Law. He was working in a Wall Street firm, not a particularly interesting clerk in that firm. Somebody came to him, a political boss, and said, would you like to run for a safe Democratic seat in Dutchess County? And it wasn't because he had shown the makings of a leader. It was because his mother was wealthy, and more importantly, had the Roosevelt name. They thought some Republicans might vote for him thinking he was Teddy Roosevelt. But the important thing is he said, I'd love to do it. And he gets out on that trail, and he found, this is what I want to be. He led a very insulated life up till that point. And suddenly he's barnstorming, he's asking people questions, he's able to talk with them naturally. Eleanor, who was there at the time, said he wasn't a great speaker at first. In fact, he'd pause so much in between his sentences that you thought he was never going to go on. And then by the end of the campaign, he was talking so long she had to go drag him off the stage. But he found something which all of these guys found, which all of us hope we will find. William James, the philosopher, said, the character of a man can be defined when they find that voice within them that says, this is the real me. He found that that's what he wanted. Lyndon Johnson, as I said, found that when he was much younger. His father was in the state legislature, and he always wanted to just become something in politics. He finally goes to Washington as the chief of staff to a congressman, and there's great stories that he tells. I mean, he gets into this hotel where all the other chiefs of staff, all the other legislative secretaries were, the Dodge Hotel, and he decides, I need to find a mentor who's going to teach me how to deal with this House of Representatives. So he goes into the bathroom 4 times in the morning to brush his teeth so that he can meet as many people as possible. And then he takes 5 showers at night, and he's asking everybody questions. And within 6 months, they said he knew more than the most veteran congressman knew. So he's always sort of an outlier in all this, but he's such a character.
Right. How does adversity affect the growth of leadership?
Well, in each one of these cases, it had a huge effect on the growth of leadership. I mean, Lincoln was in his 30s when he suffered what was considered an almost suicidal depression. He had not been able to bridge that gap between his huge ambitions and the reality of his life. He had broken his engagement to Mary Todd. He knew he had humiliated her. And he was so sad that friends worried that they took all knives and razors and scissors from his room. And his best friend came to his side and said, Lincoln, you must rally or you will die. And he said, I know that, and I would just as soon die now, but I've not yet accomplished anything to make any human being remember that I have lived. That was his lodestar, that somehow he would be able to make a difference in the world. So that allowed him to finish his term in the state legislature, have a single term in Congress, run twice for the Senate, lose twice, and then finally run as a dark horse candidate for the presidency. Hemingway said, everyone is broken by life, but some people are stronger in the broken places. And that was true of Teddy Roosevelt, too. He was a somewhat arrogant young state legislator. They say he admitted that he had a swelled hat. He was screaming and yelling in the state legislature, making headlines, but not able to really cooperate and compromise with other people. And then a terrible tragedy befell him. His wife was giving birth. They got news in Albany that she had given birth to a child. They celebrated with cigars. And then another telegram came saying, you must come home. Your wife is dying, and your mother is dying too. His mother, who was only 49, had come to take care of his wife. She got typhoid fever. She died by the time he got home. And then 12 hours later, his wife died. And that's when he left the state legislature and went to the Badlands and became the Teddy Roosevelt that people knew later, a Westerner as well as an Easterner. He said he never would have been president had it not been for that experience. And he developed this love of conservation that obviously made his legacy, that he would preserve so many natural resources. For FDR, there's no question that the polio, from that attack and from his rehabilitation center at Warm Springs, where he taught the polio victims like himself to get joy in life again, not simply to exercise in the giant pool, but to feel like they could live a full life. It made him, as he called himself, Old Doc Roosevelt, and he emerged warm-hearted, with more able to connect to people for whom fate had also dealt an unkind hand, which meant when the economy was paralyzed, he was able to give confidence and hope to the American people. For Lyndon Johnson, interestingly, it's a long story that we won't have time to go into tonight, but he was accumulating power, and he became majority leader, the most powerful majority leader of the Senate. But there wasn't really a purpose, and this goes to one of your other questions, for this power for a period of time. And he had a massive heart attack in 1955, and emerged from it. And he said to himself afterwards, if I died now, what would I be remembered for? And then he got the first civil rights bill through the Senate, and then once he became president, civil rights became what he wanted to do for the country. So I think for all of these people, wisdom came out of adversity. They grew in leadership, which is a critical thing for leaders.
Do the times make the leader, or does the leader shape the times?
Well, the times give you a chance to be a great leader, and perhaps when there's a crisis, there's a greater chance of being able to mobilize the country. But unless the leader has the strengths and the skills ready for that time, they could fail as easily as you could succeed. I mean, James Buchanan was there before Lincoln when the country was beginning to fall apart, and he's now, he was now considered, until a few months ago, the worst president. I'm not saying that, wait. There was a presidential historian's poll some months ago, and they asked who, and always Buchanan was at the bottom of the list, and they asked who was the worst president, and now President Trump had beaten Buchanan. So there was a story in the paper saying that the Buchanan relatives were all celebrating. He was no longer at the bottom. So anyway, Herbert Hoover was there before FDR, and he didn't have the kind of experimental style and the willingness to change ideology to be able to deal with the Depression. And I'm not sure that JFK would have been able to get the Civil Rights Bill through the way that LBJ, despite having lost his legacy or halved his legacy by the war in Vietnam, what he did on civil rights, what he did for the Great Society, how he was able to deal with the Congress on a bipartisan basis, I'm not sure that his predecessor could have done that. So it depends on whether you have the skills and the strengths to make use of the opportunity you're given.
What is the difference between power, title, and leadership?
That's a really important thing. You know, I'm not sure that just having a position of power entitles you to be a leader unless you have the qualities that make up a leader. And that's one of the things I've tried to figure out in this whole study. What are those qualities that these people share? There's no single path to becoming a leader, but there is a family resemblance, I think, of the qualities that these people shared. One is humility, the willingness to somehow acknowledge your errors and learn from your mistakes. Empathy, as I said, is critical. Resilience, coming through those tough times. The ability to somehow communicate with your people, and the ability to somehow control your negative emotions. The ability to have courage when the decisions are necessary. And one of my favorite unheralded activities that they all seem to share was the capacity to find the time to think and to relax and replenish their energy so that they could keep going. And we could just look at those qualities and perhaps think about their absence on the scene today.
Let's just, before we get to the last question, that issue of relaxing and replenishing, it's something that maybe we could all sort of learn something from these presidents. What did they all do?
Without a question. I mean, we think of ourselves as so busy in our 24/7 world with the cell phones following us wherever we're going that we don't have time to take away from that. Even young people seem on vacations to be having their cell phones with them everywhere, and maybe older people do too. Well, these guys that I've lived with, they were pretty busy too, but they found a way, despite civil wars, World War II, depressions, to relax. Lincoln actually went to the theater 100 times during the Civil War. He said when the lights went down and a Shakespeare play came on, for a few precious hours, he could forget the war that was raging. And his greatest form of relaxation was his ability to tell a funny story and to laugh. He said humor was his way of whistling off sadness. He had learned how to tell stories when he was on the circuit in Illinois, and he could winding down tell stories and entertain crowds for hours. Sometimes they had a moral, like Aesop's fable, but sometimes they were just simply hilarious. I was so glad I was able to convince Steven Spielberg and Daniel Day-Lewis to tell Lincoln's favorite story in the movie Lincoln, based in part on my book. And the story had to do with the Revolutionary War hero, Ethan Allen, who went to England after the war, and the English were still upset about losing the revolution. They decided to embarrass him by putting a huge picture of General George Washington in the only outhouse nearby where he'd have to encounter it. And they figured he'd be very upset about the indignity of George Washington in an outhouse. But he came out of the outhouse not upset at all. And they said, well, didn't you see George Washington there? Oh, yes, he said, I think it was the perfectly appropriate place for him. What do you mean, they said? Well, he said, there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington. And he had hundreds of these stories. So you can imagine in the middle of a tough cabinet meeting, you'll relax. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was able to spend 2 hours every afternoon on exercise, a boxing match, a wrestling game, or a raucous game of tennis, or his favorite was a walk in the woods, a hike of Rock Creek Park in this wooded area. He would take friends along with a rule. You couldn't go around any obstacle. You had to go point to point. If you came to a rock, you had to go up it. Precipice, you had to go down it. People would fall by the wayside on these walks with the president. But the best story was told by the ambassador from France. He said he arrived in his silk outfit as if we were to walk in the Champs-Élysées. He finds himself in the woods, floating up rocks and going down. Finally, we come to a stream, and he says, "Thank God it's over." And then he said, "Judge of my horror when I saw the president unbutton his clothes and heard him say, 'It's an obstacle, we can't go around it, so we don't want to get our clothes wet.' So I, too, for the honor of France, unbuttoned my clothes. However, I left on my lavender kid gloves. Should we meet ladies on the other side, it would be most embarrassing." But in some ways, the best one is FDR. During World War II, he actually had a cocktail party every night on the second floor of the White House so he could talk about anything other than the war. You weren't allowed to mention the war. So he could gossip, talk about books, movies. And after a while, this cocktail hour mattered so much to him, he wanted the people who would be at the cocktail hour to live with him in the White House to be ready for the cocktail hour. So the White House became the most exclusive residential hotel you could possibly imagine. His foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, came for dinner one night, slept over, never left until the war came to an end. His secretary, Missy Lehand, lived with the family in the White House. A reporter named Lorena Hickok, who had a friendship with Eleanor, lived next to Eleanor. A princess from Norway in exile in America during the war lived with the family on the weekends. And the great Winston Churchill came and spent weeks at a time in a bedroom diagonally across from Roosevelt's. So when I was working on the book on No Ordinary Time, I became obsessed with the thought of where did these people sleep? Where was Roosevelt? Where was Harry Hopkins? And I'd been up there with Lyndon Johnson, but of course I'd never thought of asking this, who slept where? So I mentioned this on a radio program in Washington, and it happened Hillary Clinton was listening. So she called me up at the radio station, and she invited me to sleep overnight in the White House. She said we could then wander the corridor and figure out together where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So 2 weeks later, she followed up with an invitation to a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2 a.m., the president, Mrs. Clinton, my husband, and I, with my map in hand, figured out, yes, Chelsea Clinton is sleeping where Harry Hopkins was, the Clintons are sleeping where FDR was, and we had been given Winston Churchill's bedroom, which meant there was no way I could sleep. I was certain he was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his cigar. In fact, that bedroom is the scene of another naked story. So what happened is when Churchill first came there right after Pearl Harbor, he and Roosevelt were set to sign a document that put the Associated Nations against the Axis powers, but no one really liked the word Associated Nations, so early that morning, Roosevelt awakens with a whole new idea of calling them the United Nations against the Axis powers. He was so excited, he had himself wheeled into Churchill's bedroom, our bedroom, to tell him the news, but it so happened that Churchill was just coming out of the bathtub and had nothing on. So Roosevelt said, "I'm so sorry, I'll come back in a few moments," but Churchill, ever able to speak in a very formal voice, said, "Oh no, please stay. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." So the next morning, I couldn't wait to go in the bathtub, and then I was truly in the presence of the greatness of the past.
The final question of those that you grappled with as a young person, is leadership possible without purpose larger than personal ambition?
Certainly, genuine leadership is not possible without the transformation. Perhaps many of these people go into politics in the first place because they have a personal ambition, but something triggers them at a certain point to want to do something more than that, earlier for some than others. And when that ambition becomes for the larger purpose, for the country, for an institution that you're leading, for a school if you're the head of the school, for a classroom if you're a teacher, that's when it becomes something that is memorable, and that's when ambition really makes you a leader, not just a power holder. And that's what we keep looking for today in so many of our people in Washington.
I was struck in reading the book how these men came to power through different paths, through leadership and their political ambitions. LBJ, as you said, seemed to come out of the womb with ambition. With regard to the Roosevelts and to Lincoln, you write this: while Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt all possessed inherent leadership capacities, the period of time when they first perceived themselves as leaders and were considered leaders by others occurred at different stages of their growth. And I wonder, were they sort of epiphany moments for them? And was it obvious to others that these men were destined for greatness?
Yeah, it's something I really tried to think about when I was working on this that I hadn't thought about before with all the other fat biographies that I'd written. I think, for example, for Lincoln, when he won the second time, when he won the first time, the second time he tried for the state legislature, suddenly all of his friends are chipping in to buy him suitable clothing to go to Springfield. They saw in him the makings of a leader. And then he began, I think, more to feel it within himself. He felt that sense of other people looking toward him as their leader, and then that feeling grew as time went on. With Lyndon Johnson, I mean, he's always sort of an outlier in all these things. Even that sense of being able to relax, he never was able to relax. When I used to swim with him, when I was helping him on his memoirs down at his ranch, he had this giant pool, and you would think you could exercise in it, but there were floating rafts with floating notepads and floating telephones on every part of the pool, so you could only stand there. But he, I think, interestingly, he recognized himself as a leader. Earlier on, I said he was mostly accumulating power, but there was one moment when he left college for a year because he couldn't afford to continue without working, and he became a teacher in Cotulla, a Mexican-American community in Texas. And he later said he saw the pain of prejudice on those kids' faces. They were so poor that he kicked in his salary to buy them sporting equipment, and he became the principal, the debate coach, the band leader, everything. And he learned the fulfillment, he said then, of doing something for other people, and he never forgot that moment. Much later, when he was giving the We Shall Overcome speech with the Voting Rights Act, he recalled that moment, and he said, I never thought then, in 1928, that I could be standing here today with the power to do something for the sons and daughters of those kids that I saw, that I just wanted to fire with ambition so that they could get to the point where their discipline and talent might take them. But I have that power now, and I mean to use it. With Teddy Roosevelt, I think it was when he was a captain in the Army, and he said he knew within a matter of weeks that he wasn't as good a horseman as some of the Rough Riders. He didn't have the athletic skill of some of them. He wasn't as strong as the other ones, but he knew he was their leader, and he knew they knew that about him. So, and I think for FDR, as I say, when he was Doc Roosevelt in that Warm Springs Rehab Center, and he watched the way the other people were able to feel the contagion of his optimism, he knew then that there was some special quality. So they all, it was triggered at a different point in their lives.
Did these, I've noticed that when presidents in our times are asked, what are you reading? They frequently cite biographies that they're reading. And I wonder, did these men look to history for guidance, and who were their heroes?
It's so interesting because there's almost a family tree of their heroes, because LBJ's hero was FDR. He considered FDR his political daddy. He had met him when he was a young congressman, and FDR actually was really impressed with the young congressman, Lyndon Johnson, so much so that he said if he had not gone to Harvard, FDR, he might have been like this Bronco, LBJ. He liked his style, and he predicted that maybe someday, if ever a Southern president were to become president, it would be LBJ.
Let me just stop you for a second, because you also write about LBJ earlier in his life and how calculating and ruthless he was, even in college, and how people either loved him or often hated him. And I wonder, someone like FDR, when he would look at a Johnson, could he identify that immediately? Did he see that in a fellow politician?
I think he saw a relentless energy in LBJ. I mean, when LBJ was first in college, as you suggest, he knew that he wanted to get near power. So he figured that I should get to know the president of the college. So he had a work job. They all had to have a work job in the janitorial crew. So he asked to be assigned to mop outside the president's office. And the next thing you know, he's talking to the president. The next thing you know, he's a clerk in the president's office. The next thing you know, he's running the president's office. I mean, he was able to use that escalator of power to keep going upward and upward. But as I say, at a certain point, you know, something triggered in him when he went to Cotulla. And then he lost that for a while as he was running in conservative Texas. But he never forgot that originally he'd been a New Deal congressman under FDR. And then FDR's hero was Teddy Roosevelt. Not only was Eleanor Teddy's niece, but more important, and Teddy had actually given Franklin and Eleanor away at the wedding, but he just loved the colorful nature of Teddy. He was such a popular president, and he saw him as his mentor. Teddy's hero was Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, in the summer when he had a terrible coal strike, he read the entire 8 volumes that Nicolay and Hay had written about Abraham Lincoln, and he would talk about him. Lincoln did this in this circumstance, maybe I can do that. And Lincoln's hero was George Washington and the Founding Fathers. So the whole history of our country is contained. It shows what a short history it is in each one of these, looking back to the person that they admired most and before that. So it's like a family tree.
It is. One of the things you bring out is how storytelling is such a sort of strong communication tool, yes, but also a theme that runs through all of them. You write, storytelling played a central role in young Lyndon's life, just as it had in the lives of young Abraham, Theodore, and Franklin. You talk about how each president used these tools of their times to communicate effectively. What were the tools, and did they just come up with the tools themselves, or like today, did they have a team of strategists and aides telling them you should do a fireside chat or whatever it is?
No, it's interesting that, I mean, all of them did understand that the best way to communicate to people were through stories. Lincoln said, people used to ask me, why do I tell so many stories? And he said, because people remember stories with a beginning, middle, and end better than they do facts and figures. But each one did understand what was the technology of their time. They were lucky. I mean, Lincoln had a gift for language, so the written word was obviously so important at that time, which made it easy. All of the speeches then would be printed in full in newspapers and then reprinted in pamphlets so that people could read them aloud in city homes and country farms. When Teddy comes along, that punchy language that he had was perfectly suited for the rise of the national press. When FDR comes, he had the perfect voice and the intimate style of speaking for the radio. And the radio allowed him to have an intimate connection to people that wouldn't have been possible before, which was perfect for his style of speaking. It was said when one of his fireside chats was on the air, 8 out of 10 radios would be tuned in. Saul Bellow said you could walk down the street on a hot Chicago night. When one of his fireside chats was going on, you could look in and see everybody in their kitchens and living rooms looking at the radio. You could hear his voice coming out into the street, and you could keep walking and not miss a word of what he was saying. There's a moment when a construction worker is going home and his partner said, where are you going? And he said, well, my president, he's coming into my living room to talk to me tonight. It's only right that I be there to greet him when he comes. So intimate was that bond he created. And then when we had the 3 television networks, it allowed power and the bully pulpit to be utilized by Ronald Reagan and by JFK. And now it's become much more complicated with the rise of divided cable networks, the social media, and in a certain sense, I mean, President Trump must be admitted that during the campaign, he was able to master that form of the Twitter world, and it allowed him to reach way beyond the cable world. The problem has been that campaigning is different from governing. Even when Lincoln became president, he was great. As I was saying earlier, he had mocked this person, but more than that, he had quick retorts to everything. At a certain point, somebody said to him when he was campaigning, Lincoln, you're two-faced. And he said, if I had 2 faces, do you think I'd be wearing this face? And he could have spoken extemporaneously better than anyone. But he said once he became president, his words mattered. So even when he would be called upon to celebrate a Union victory, he would simply thank the soldiers, talk about the country, sing the songs with the Union people and with the people that had come to serenade him, and wait for prepared speeches, because he knew that anything he said would be taken so seriously with weight. And I think one of the problems with our daily world today, not just our politicians, is that quick retort, what you say in an instant email or an instant tweet, and not understanding how hurtful or how difficult those words can be to somebody else.
You talk about some of the common traits that you found in these men: humility, empathy, resilience, and you also talked about temperament. And how important is temperament in these men?
I think temperament is key. I mean, they said about Franklin Roosevelt that he had a first-rate temperament and a second-rate intellect. I don't think he had a second-rate intellect, but he did have a first-rate temperament. And what does temperament mean? It really means how you look at the world, how you treat the people around you. I mean, the best part of these leaders that I've studied, they built a team that they would allow strong-minded people to argue on their team, but they'd be able to keep them together, to inspire them to common action. They were able, most of them, maybe not Lyndon Johnson all the time, to control their negative emotions. Lincoln had this wonderful ritual when he got mad at somebody, which he would write a hot letter to the person, as he called it, and then put the letter aside, hoping he would cool down psychologically and never need to send it. how much better many of us would be if we did that today. Or FDR had this wonderful ritual when he was working on his fireside chats. They would go through 5 or 6 drafts, and if he were angry at, say, an isolationist congressman, and they'd all be gathered around reading aloud the first draft, and he'd say terrible things about this person. He'd call him by name, say he was a traitor, and a younger speechwriter came along and said, I can't believe he's going to do that. The older guy said, wait till the second draft. His name will no longer be there. Wait till the third draft. He won't be such a bad guy after all. Wait till the fourth draft. All will be sweetness and life. But he got the anger out of his system. When I interviewed President Obama for an exit interview for Vanity Fair, I was talking to him about the hot letters, and I said, do you ever think of doing that? He said, I do it all the time. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I write angry letters to people, and then I said, what do you do with them? He said, I crumble them up and put them in the wastebasket. How much fun it would be to find those letters in the wastebasket. But they knew that it was important when you're with people. Now, with Lyndon Johnson, at times his anger would burst out. There was one moment when he goes up to somebody who has a cluttered desk and he screams at them, you're disorganized. He goes up to somebody who has a neat desk and he says, you're idle, what's wrong with your desk? And there's a moment when somebody's writing a letter. This is when he was heading the NYA, National Youth Administration, when he's young. And he sees the guy writing a letter to his mother and he said, son, can't you do that and take a crap on your own time, please? But he was able to give people a sense of a common mission, and then he would be really sorry every time he did that, and he might hug the person or give them a gift. But more importantly, he gave them a sense of a common mission, and his NYA was considered the best in the country because they all felt they were doing something for other people, and they could take this kind of difficult character behavior.
Let's talk about Lyndon Johnson. You had a special relationship with him. You worked for him. You helped him with his memoirs. You were a White House fellow who got his attention by writing an article titled How to Dump Lyndon Johnson. How did he react to that article? And so start there. How did he react to that article?
Well, what happened is when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I got selected as a White House fellow. This fabulous program. Colin Powell was a White House fellow, Wesley Clark. We had a big dance. Excuse me a second. We had a big dance in the White House the night we were selected. He did dance with me, not that peculiar. There were only 3 women out of the 16 White House fellows. But as he twirled me around the floor, he whispered that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. But it was not to be that simple, for in the months leading up to my selection, like many young people, I'd been active in the anti-Vietnam War movement and had written this article against him with a friend of mine, which we'd sent to the New Republic, had heard nothing until several days after the dance in the White House, it came out with this title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson from Power. So I was certain he would kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So I did eventually end up working for him in the White House, and then accompanying him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs those last years of his life, never fully understanding why he had chosen me to spend so many hours with. I like to believe it was because I was a good listener, and he was a great storyteller, and I loved listening to his stories. So maybe it was because I liked listening to these tales that he spent so much time to me. But I also worried that part of it was that I was then a young woman, and he had somewhat of a minor league womanizing reputation. So I was constantly chattering to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. Everything was perfect until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous when he took me nearby to the lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Baines Johnson. And there was wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started outdoors more than any other woman I have ever known. And my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing, given what was going on in my mind.
Working so closely with him, how did your perception of him change from that sort of caricature that you must have perceived when you wrote that article versus the man you came to know intimately?
Yeah, I think it really was an absolutely critical experience. It's probably why I became a presidential historian, for number one. I had majored and gotten my PhD in Supreme Court history. So bizarrely, that's what I might have been writing about today, but much more fun to be writing about these presidential characters. But much more important, even though he didn't change my mind about the war, I really began to understand why he did what he did, why the mistakes were made, and I began to feel empathy for him in those last years because he was so sad. I mean, he knew that his legacy had been cut in two, and he knew how much he had done. And I only wish he had lived. I'm so glad that his daughters have lived to see that historians now are totally aware of what happened during those 18 months before the war began to cut everything in two. I mean, when he first came into office after JFK was assassinated, he made the decision, which was incredibly courageous, to risk everything to get that civil rights bill to end segregation through the Congress. His friends told him, you'll never get it through, they'll filibuster it, it won't happen, you'll be a failed president 11 months from now. And then he said, well, what the hell is the presidency for anyway? And then with his great bipartisan capacities, he was able to get the Republicans to come on his side and join the Democrats to break that filibuster. And I just watched as he used to talk to me about it, the enormous skill that he had. I mean, he would talk to me about how he got Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader, to come with him. You know, he would give him everything under the sun. He'd have drinks together. He'd promise him anything he wanted in Illinois, any project, a postmastership here. I'll come to Springfield. I'll do anything you want. But most importantly, he understood that Dirksen also wanted to be remembered. So he says to him, Everett, you come with me on this bill and bring some Republicans to help the Democrats in the North break the filibuster. And 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist? But anyway, it wasn't only the Civil Rights Bill, it was the Voting Rights Bill, it was fair housing, it was Medicare, it was Medicaid, aid to education, PBS, NPR, immigration reform. It was an extraordinary group of legislation that he passed, changing the face of our country. And I saw when I talked to him how much that meant to him, and I saw the sadness in him in those last years. And all he would say to me over and over again was he hoped if ever he were remembered, it would be for civil rights. And there was an extraordinary moment right near the end of his life. He had had another heart attack when he was at the ranch, and they were opening the civil rights papers at his library, and he so wanted to be there. And the doctor said, you can't go. He was having continual pain. He needed oxygen during the day, and he said, I have to go. So he drives himself there. It was his chauffeur was driving too slowly. He took over the wheel, even though he hadn't been driving for months. And he gets to the platform, and he walked up the steps very haltingly. People could see he wasn't well. He's only 6 weeks away from dying. And he had to pop a nitroglycerin into his mouth because the pain was so great. And then he stood up there, and what he said was, it was a symposium. All the civil rights leaders were there. They were going to spend 2 days with these papers. And he said, I don't want you to say everything we've done. I want you to say what we haven't done. In fact, I feel like we should have done so much more, and we should never be able to settle until the black man and the white man stand on equal ground. And then he reprised his famous statement when he gave the voting rights speech to a joint session of Congress, saying it will take maybe a long time for that equality to happen, but if we work at it, we shall overcome, taking up this anthem of the civil rights movement. And that's when change happens in our country, when the outside movement comes to the leader inside and they can partner. It was the anti-slavery movement, Lincoln said, that did it all. You know, it was the progressive movement under Teddy and Franklin, and then it was civil rights under LBJ. And I do believe that historians are finally giving him his due domestically, and I'm so glad for that, because he deserves every moment of that.
You write about this poignant moment where you're in the Oval with Mr. Johnson, and it's the end of the presidency, and he asks you to help him with his memoirs, and you'd been resisting because you wanted to go back to Harvard, and you finally said, yes, I'll do it. And can you take us into the Oval and tell us about that
what
moment?
happened is in those last months before his presidency was over, he'd asked me if I would come and stay in Austin and at the ranch and help him on his memoirs full time. And I really wanted so badly to go back and start teaching at Harvard. And I kept saying to him, could we please do it part-time? I could come on vacations, I could come in the summers. And he said, no, it's all or nothing. And then he started the Johnson treatment on me. He said, why wouldn't a young girl want to go work for a president? You want to be a presidential historian? I'm a president. What's the matter? Do you want boyfriends? I'll import them every weekend. Do you want to travel around the world? I'll be going around the world. You could go with me. And he said, what, do you want to write? Well, I'll get you a house by the lake at Lake LBJ. And then I thought, my God, well, he's right. What is the matter with me? What girl in her right mind wouldn't do this? But I knew somehow that he was so powerful that you needed some distance from him. And I also did want to go back to my friends at Harvard. So he said, okay, that's it, all or nothing. On the last day he was in the Oval Office, before he was going to turn it over to Nixon, he asked me to come in and see him, and he just looked at me and said, all right, part-time. But then he said, will you come part-time? And I said, of course I will. And then as I left, and this is what you're referring to, he said, you know, it's not easy when you're not on the top of the world anymore to get people to come with you. I won't forget it. But just make sure when you go back to Harvard, you won't let those Harvards poison your feelings toward me. I mean, the way he talked, you know, the one thing that's, I think, helped with the renaissance of his reputation to some extent now are that he kept these tapes in his Oval Office. Whenever he was wanting an important conversation, he had a button to press, and then the conversation would be recorded. And they show how incredibly strategic he was, not just bullying people, but able to charm them as well. And so those tapes have, I think, brought about an understanding for him. But anyway, when we were on the memoirs, we were able to use those tapes to some extent. But I heard a story much later by the CEO of Pepsi-Cola who told me that he had known Lyndon Johnson when much earlier. And he said, I know you knew him when I was young, but I have a story to tell. So he told me that when Nixon first came into office, he asked this guy, Don Kendall, who was friendly with Nixon and with Johnson, to go to Johnson's ranch to talk about some controversial matter. So he said, he gets to the ranch, Johnson's working on his memoirs, and he's grumpily looking up, how am I supposed to remember what happened 30 years ago, 20 years ago? Only chapters are any good at all. I had this little button in my Oval Office, I could press it, and I've got these great tapes. So you go back and tell your good friend Nixon as he starts the presidency, there's nothing more important than a taping system. And thereby he contributes to the downfall of his good friend Richard Nixon.
Oh my goodness. I think we want to take some questions from the crowd, but I want to ask you one final question. It's not fair at all, given your closeness to LBJ and your how much you clearly love all of these men that you write about. But who's your favorite?
I think probably on a human level, there's nobody to match Abraham Lincoln. I just kept feeling that if I could be more like him, I mean, it wasn't that he didn't have the normal human emotions of envy or anger or jealousy, but he would say that somehow, unless you could let these emotions damp down, they would fester inside and poison a part of you. So every time, I mean, the ability that he had to let past resentments go away, to allow somebody who had hurt him in the past, if that person could help him in the present, to not allow that to influence who he would put into his cabinet, putting all of his rivals into his cabinet. But much more importantly, I just think that forgiving spirit, when I think about that second inaugural, if only we had somebody speaking in that language in these decades now, when he talks about the sin of slavery shared by both sides, no triumphal message does he deliver after the Union has finally won this war, but rather he says both sides prayed to the same God, Bible, both prayed to the same God, neither's prayers were fully answered. And then those famous words, with malice toward none and charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. How wonderful it would be if that man could come back and speak to us today.
Thank you. Ted, I can keep going, but I'm not sure. Am I supposed to throw it over to you now?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Frank. First, many thanks for all the questions that this lovely audience sent in, well over 100 of them.
Whoa.
So,
Shall we have a pajama party?
first question, Doris, if you could change one thing in the Constitution, what would that be?
Oh my gosh. Well, interestingly, I suppose what you would have hoped in the earlier days was that if the Constitution had not protected property, and thereby slavery was protected by the Constitution, then maybe we could have been born as a country without that sin of slavery on our whole hearts and minds. And perhaps the war that tore us apart, that still has legacies after it, and did for years and years and years, and probably still does today, might not have happened. So if I were back with those old framers, I might try to take on the task of what do we do about slavery before we built this extraordinary country in the first place.
If FDR were alive today, what do you think he would say to members of Congress and the President about the tenor of Washington today and its impact on our country?
Well, you know, when FDR first came into office, you know, he was able to mobilize both Republicans and Democrats to pass the emergency legislation that was needed during that 100 days. And I think he understood, as LBJ did too, that if you can get both sides working on the same set of problems, that any problem can be solved. And I think both he and LBJ would both be terribly disheartened by that sense in the tribal sense that we've now sensed in Washington. I mean, even during the decades of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, you were able to get congressmen to stay in Washington on the weekends. They knew each other as human beings. You know, this whole last couple of weeks when it was seen that it was such a wonderful thing that Senator Flake and Senator Coons were friends, that used to happen regularly. They stayed in Washington, their wives knew each other, their children were there, they played poker together, they drank together, and there was a sense of belonging to that institution of the Congress or the Senate that superseded their own party ambitions and their partisan nature. And I think some of that maybe had to do in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 50s with the fact that so many congressmen and senators had been in World War II or the Korean War together, so they knew what it was like to have a common mission to work and against party lines and make you go together that way. There's sometimes when I think of what we could do to heal the country, and I think about how much that military service, when people have it, gives them that sense of working for something beyond themselves, but not wanting to have to simply have military service. If we could have a real national service program where kids coming out of high school can work for a year in service somewhere else in other parts of the country where they can learn how to be with each other in a different way. Eleanor Roosevelt called for this, Teddy Roosevelt called for this, there are now generals who are calling for this, and if I had one thing that I could do if I were young again, it would be to fight for a national service program for our young people.
In working on this book, would you comment on the difference between leadership in public service and in the civic realm versus business leadership, and this tendency that someone who's a successful business leader can transform themselves and be a civic leader?
I think I don't think the difference is if you're a leader of a large institution where you've had to build teams in business world, where you've had to worry about customers and shareholders and your team members and the country, if you're a global citizen as a leader. It's human nature that leadership is involved with, so that I think that I think there's not that many differences in the qualities that I'm talking about as to whether you're leading a team and you're a principal of a school or a nonprofit, or you're a business leader or you're a political leader. The difference, I think, to be honest, about our current president is that those leadership experiences, he had a different kind of business. It was him, and it was his brand, and he was very successful at that. But that's different from a larger organization where you have to bring people together for a common goal. So, in fact, I'm hoping that in some ways, when people read this book, if you're a young person, you might even aspire to be a leader because of seeing what the traits were that these people had in common. In fact, the reason I started the book with when they were young, when they were going to still be struggling with failure and having to learn from their mistakes, is because I was in a college audience and a person raised their hand. I was talking about leadership lessons from the White House, and a young kid said, how can I ever become one of them? You know, they're on Mount Rushmore, they're on the currency. So I figured if I started when they struggle, that people can learn from that. And to your earlier question, I think that idea that somehow these lessons have something to do with our everyday life, not simply with presidents in power, because all leadership is about human nature. It's about how you treat people, it's how you think about yourself, it's whether you can manage yourself and manage others. I'm not even sure I see where you are, I just hear your voice.
Over here,
coming out.
stage left.
Somewhere over
around
there.
Go ahead.
Doris, gentleman asks, presidents have typically reserved comments about their successors. President Obama recently has spoken about Trump. How have the presidents that you have studied handled speaking about their predecessors?
Yeah, I mean, what you would hope from presidents is not a question only of what they'd say about the former president or the person who comes after them, but how they can learn from the former presidents. It's such a small club that you would hope that somehow when a president leaves office, he can tell the next guy that comes in power what he learned, what the difficulties were. Only these few people have exercised this thing. And there's no reason to feel you have to obliterate the person who came before you unless you're sort of feeling this competitiveness that you can't be good on your own. You have to somehow undo the person before you. So a toxic atmosphere, I think, was set up right from the start between Presidents Obama and then President Trump that certainly wasn't felt between Bush and Clinton, who later became friends. And I think then that in turn has led President Obama to feel that the state of the country required him to speak out, which is pretty unusual. I mean, I think most of them feel a sense of that they shouldn't be talking about their guy before because they know how difficult the job is, so they appreciate that. But we're in, as everybody said, in 100 ways, we're in unprecedented times now, and things that didn't happen in the past are happening now. And I think part of that lack of decorum is on both sides is part of that current atmosphere that we're in today.
It used to be that gubernatorial experience or experience in Congress was what set somebody up with the right timber to be president. Will future presidents now have to be rich or media stars?
I worry very much about the celebrity part, in that we seem to be demanding that a president entertain us as well as lead us. And then when you start hearing certain celebrities now saying they're going to run for office, once you open the door for one, then they all might feel I can be a sports figure and I can be a movie star and I can run for president. I'm hoping that what the difficulties of the current president show, and not even just being Trump, but anybody who comes into that office without the experience of having led people in a number of places, I think it's got to show how complicated it is to be president. And I keep wishing that, even though I know our politicians let us down, and that's one of the reasons why an outsider was able to make it to this point in the presidency, because people didn't honor what the politicians were doing, and little wonder, since they couldn't get anything done for really a long period of time on a party basis. It was always one party would get something done and then the other party would, but not being able to get together. I think if in a democracy we can't find people in public service who we feel we honor, and there's still something extraordinary, I think, about politics as a vocation. I mean, JFK used to talk about what an honorable vocation it was. If you can go into politics, and as we were talking earlier, you can broaden your experiences by being involved with people that you might never be involved with in your more insulated life, it's an extraordinary thing, and you can change people's lives. So somehow I have to hope that the one great thing, as I was saying earlier, that's happening now, so many young people are interested in politics that might not have been before, given this turbulent time. And you've got this new raft of people running for office. And that's a positive thing, because we need to have not just spectators, as I said earlier, but we need to have citizens who are active in public life. And maybe we'll just get a whole new group of people into Washington, and they'll take the place of the old one, and we can start over again with that bipartisanship that we need so badly.
Well, Ted, can I jump in for a second and just ask to that point, is it fixable? And is it a generational fix? Or is it just a matter of removing the leadership of both sides and replacing it with more sensible leadership?
I mean, it has to be fixable. I mean, the majority of the people in the country want to have some people in power who can heal the divisions, who can get something done, who can treat each other, as fellow politicians and not as tribal enemies. And I'm sure there are people currently in Congress and currently in the Senate who feel that way, who are able to bridge those divides. But the partisanship has become so hardened. I think we're going to have to redraw congressional boundaries so that it's not partisan drawing, because that only exacerbates the people on one side or the other. We're going to have to figure out some way to get money out of the system. There's no question that no wonder people don't want to run for public life when they know they're going to be spending so much of their time raising money. It is the poison in our system, and we can fix it. There are laws that can change it. We could undo Citizens United with a constitutional amendment if we have to. And I think what we need are targets. We need that's one of the things that all these guys understood. When Roosevelt first was involved with the 1940, when the war in Europe had already started and we were so far behind Germany, and he decided that we only had like 4,000 planes at that point, fighter planes. And so he made this statement, we're going to get 50,000 planes made this year. And people said, you're crazy, we can't possibly do that. He said, no, people need an imaginative target to work for something. We need targets, a constitutional amendment, as I say, for ending Citizens United, redrawing those congressional boundaries. There's got to be like 5 or 6 or 7 things that we can do that will make us feel like we're successful, and then you build on change that way, slowly, 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 but moving forward at every moment.
All right, 2 final questions. It's LA, and this question always comes up. The movie adaptation of your work I understand you were a consultant on All the Way with Bryan Cranston, and you obviously were involved in the Spielberg making of Lincoln. Could you share any stories or tell us what that was like?
Oh, I'd be glad to. I mean, I'll quickly tell the story about All the Way. I came out here to California when Bryan Cranston was playing Lyndon Johnson, and I had already met him because he had come to have dinner at my house to meet my husband, because my husband had been so critical in the LBJ administration, writing all of his great civil rights speeches. And we got to be friendly with Bryan Cranston. And then finally I came out to watching him, because I'd been a consultant on the movie, in one of the scenes he was playing, and they deliberately arranged the scene so that when I came in the room, Bryan Cranston, as LBJ, was sitting on a bed with the pajamas on, and he calls me into the room saying, "Doris, come sit by my side." I thought Lyndon Johnson was back. I thought I was going to faint. It was incredible. His presentation was perfect. The relationship with Steven Spielberg and Daniel A. Lewis was an extraordinary experience in my life. Earlier on, Spielberg had bought the rights to Team of Rivals because he'd always wanted to make a movie about Abraham Lincoln. And he bought it even before I'd finished the book, and he had 2 scriptwriters working on it. And they wrote some good scripts, but neither of those scripts did Daniel Day-Lewis say yes for, and he knew that Daniel was his Lincoln. So finally, when Kushner came along, the book came out, he wrote the script, Daniel said yes. So immediately Spielberg called me and he said, would I take him to Springfield to show him the sights? But he wanted to go under an assumed name. He didn't want anybody to know he was becoming Lincoln, because he demanded an entire year to become Lincoln before he had to even start filming. So we went on the plane together to Springfield. We already became friends on the plane. He's a remarkable human being. When we got to the hotel, we were supposed to just eat in the hotel, and I told all my friends who would be taking him around on all the sites, just pretend you don't know who he is. So he said, no, let's go out to a bar. So we went to a bar, and immediately somebody bought us drinks, and I thought, oh my God, it's already over. But they didn't recognize him, they recognized me, so it was a huge joke. So anyway, I took him around the next day, I showed him everything, and then for a year I would send him books, we would text each other as he gradually became Abraham Lincoln. But he had so become Abraham Lincoln, when I went to the filming, he wouldn't let anybody who knew him watch him filming, so you couldn't watch him on the days he was filming, because he was Lincoln. Even the other actors had to call him Mr. President the whole time. So I never saw Daniel Day-Lewis, my friend, until the premiere in LA and then in New York. And when we got to New York, he said we have to go to a bar, his favorite bar, the Carlyle, to celebrate that night in the first bar. So we go, and I have these crazy old Cuban drinks that he loves. Everything is fine. And then he gets the first of a series of awards, and Spielberg comes to give him the New York Critics Circle Award. And he tells the story of how many times he'd wanted Daniel to be this. He'd written these beautiful rejection letters Daniel had to Spielberg saying the scripts are lovely, but not for me, until he finally accepted. Daniel gets up there and he says, I don't reject everything. When Doris Kearns Goodwin asked me to go binge drinking with her, I accepted it once. And there was a Wall Street reporter in the room, so it was in the newspapers the next day. I was very honored, very honored. But it was a great experience. There's a camaraderie in working on a movie that you don't have as a writer. Luckily, my husband was a writer too, so the two of us could write together in our home. And then every night, we would actually go out with our group of friends to local bars, because we wanted that socialness of that situation that you don't have when you become a writer. So it was a really grand experience to be part of that movie making, and I'm proud enough, to know that hopefully some other of the books I've been working on, and my best friend and I have working now on a series of movie projects, so hopefully that's the world that I can enter a little bit more. So I may be in LA a lot more as a result.
Excellent.
And our final question of the evening comes from Marilyn Rose, who says, I know you're a huge baseball fan. Of the active players today, who is your favorite and why?
Well, if I can go back to the past first, as a historian was, when I was little as a Brooklyn Dodger fan, my favorite player was Jackie Robinson, without a question. And I'd like to believe it was because I saw him as a civil rights leader, but I think it was more he was just so exciting on the base path. And when he would round the bases and steal second, third, and home, he rattled the pitcher, and I just knew he was in charge of the situation. And I remember when I was young, I always wanted to get his autograph, and his line was always too long. Those days you never had to pay for autographs, you could just wait online, but I was too impatient until finally, when I was a young teenager, I brought my autograph book to Ebbets Field, hoping I could get his autograph. And in those days, any of you women who are older like me know we had these ridiculous autograph books where you'd say, "I will love you till rubber tires," or "I will cherish you till Niagara Falls." So I had all these stupid sayings in there, and I finally got to the top of the line, and I handed him the book thinking he'd just signed, and he looked like one of my best friends. And so he signed, he looked at, and he started reading all these things. I was so embarrassed. But then in keeping with the entire tone of the autograph book, he wrote, "Keep your smile a long, long while, Jackie Robinson."
Oh.
So he was my buddy. I mean, and then later, when I became a Red Sox fan, and understand that Walter O'Malley ripped them away from us in Brooklyn. And we hated him so much. I used to write petitions to him to keep them back in Brooklyn. But anyways, so when I became a Red Sox fan, my favorite player was David Ortiz. I mean, I still will never, ever forget what it was like in 2004 when we finally won the first World Series since 1918. And we were down 3 games to the New York Yankees, and then we went to Yankee Stadium, and he would, at the last minute, every clutch, and he was such a great player. He had passion. He played like a little boy, and that's what you want from your sporting figures, is that they don't take the game more seriously than they take themselves, and they understand the importance to a team, to a community. I mean, obviously, you know, you all people who are Dodger fans, it's going to be incredible that you're going to be moving forward, even after tonight, if I presume that they've won, if they were 5-0 in the 8th. 6-0, all right. So, you know, baseball for me, I mean, as I think many of you know, it was a part of the reason I became an historian, and I'll just end on this, because when I was a little girl, my father taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games. So while he was in Brooklyn during the day, I grew up in Long Island, I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. So he'd come home, and for many, many minutes, I would record the history of that afternoon's game, telling him every play of every inning, and he made me feel I was telling him a fabulous story. It makes you think there's something magic about history to keep your father's attention. He made it even more special for me when I was only 6 years old. He never told me that all of this was actually described in great detail in the sports pages of the newspaper the next day. So I thought without me, he wouldn't even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so that love of baseball that he instilled in me, I later instilled in my own children. And I have 3 sons. And though my father died before I got married and had the kids, I've passed his memory as well as his love of baseball on to the kids. And there are times, I must say now, when I can sit at Fenway Park and imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below, Jackie Robinson, Duke Snyder, Gil Hodges, Pee Wee Reese. There is magic in these moments. But when I open my eyes and I see my sons in the place where my father once sat, I feel what I think so many people do who love sports and share it with their family, an invisible loyalty and love linking my sons to the grandfather whose face they never had a chance to see, but whose heart and soul they have come to know through all the stories I have told. So I think in the end, I will always be so grateful for this curious love of history, allowing me to spend a lifetime looking back into the past, allowing me to believe that the private people that we've loved and lost in our families and the public figures we've respected in history really can live on so long as we pledge to tell and to retell the stories of their lives. I thank you so much for letting me do that with you tonight.
Thank you, Doris.